A few years ago now, there were some really big claims made by the bike industry about plus tyres, that's 2.8 to 3 inches wide. Some brands claimed that they were smoother, faster rolling over rough terrain, and offered more grip. The really unusual thing about these claims is that I actually found them to be largely true. For everything from smooth fire roads to technical downhill tracks, I was consistently posting better times on the 3-inch tyres than on the narrower 2.3-inch tyres. But despite this, plus tyres and plus bikes just didn't really sell. There weren't very many options when it came to buying plus tyres, and those that were available were very expensive. A lot of them punctured very easily, and they could feel vague if pushed hard in corners unless you got the pressures just right. Professional racers didn't use them, and they were seen as a kind of beginner's option. But there's a lot of buzz in the bike industry nowadays about 2.6-inch tyres. People are saying that they're a kind of Goldilocks solution, offering some of the benefits of plus tyres, but without as many of the drawbacks. To find out if there's any truth in this, I've been testing 2.3-inch, 2.6-inch and 2.8-inch tyres against each other, against the clock, on a wide variety of terrain. The tyres I chose for this were Specialized Butcher, purely because they're available in all 3 sizes, with the same casing thickness, the same tread pattern and the same compound. The bike I chose to test on also happens to be from Specialized. It's their Enduro Comp 27.5 because it's designed around 2.6-inch tyres, but it also has room to fit in the 2.8-inch tyres. As for the wheels, I did consider using different rim widths for each tyre. However, that would introduce too many variables in terms of wheel stiffness and also wheel weight. In the end, I decided to use the same rim width for each tyre size. I used wheels from our sponsor Hunt. I used their Enduro wide wheel set, which has a 33mm internal width, which I think was a good compromise between the 2.3-inch and the 2.8-inch tyres. It's quite a realistic rim width for both extremes of that spectrum of tyre sizes. Also, they were able to send me 3 wheel sets, which was really useful because I could swap wheels without having to change the tyres off the rims, which meant I could swap wheels between each run, which was hugely beneficial for the testing. I tend to break a lot of wheels, but I had no issues with these, which meant I could just carry on with testing. Before I could get into the testing, the first job was to work out what tyre pressures I needed with all 3 tyres. That's because a bigger tyre will perform differently at the same pressure than a smaller tyre. That's because the tyre holds up the rider and resists deforming and squirming because the casing of the tyre is under tension. So it's that tension that's the most important number, not the number of PSI that's inside the tyre. The tension depends on the air pressure inside the tyre, but also on the surface area of the tyre casing that the pressure is pushing up against. So to get the same tension in the tyre, the pressure inside needs to be inversely proportional to the surface area of the inside of the tyre. So what I did was I first worked out the pressures I needed in the 2.3-inch tyres by doing a lot of riding on them. And that turned out to be 24 PSI in the front and 27 PSI in the rear. It's a bit more than I would usually use because these tyres have quite a flexible sidewall and quite a square tread pattern, so they need quite a lot of pressure to avoid collapsing in turns. Then to work out the equivalent pressures in the 2.6 and the 2.8-inch tyres, I divided those pressures by the ratio of the total width of the tyre in the 2.3 relative to the 2.6 and the 2.8. And that gave these pressures that you can see on the screen now. And those pressures gave the same casing tension in all 3 tyres. This is all quite theoretical, so to check that it worked in the real world, I did a lot of back-to-back runs with the tyres at these pressures. Then I did some back-to-back runs with the tyres at 10% less pressure. I found that the tyres performed quite similarly, both in terms of how much squirm I had in corners, but also in terms of the rims bottoming out on the ground at the same places on each tyre. It's worth mentioning that at these pressures, the measured width across the carcass of the tyre is not the same as what's printed on the side. So the 2.3-inch tyres do actually measure up at 2.30 inches wide, but the 2.6s measure up at 2.44 and the 2.8s 2.66. It's actually completely normal for tyres to measure up narrower than advertised, but bear in mind that when we're talking about the tyres, we're talking about the quoted width written on the sidewall, not the actual width that I measured with the tyres on the rims. So the tyres I tested weighed 890 grams for the 2.3s, 940 grams in 2.6 and 1,050 grams in 2.8. So for a pair of tyres, that's about a 320 gram weight penalty when comparing the extremes, so the 2.3 to the 2.8. You might want to add a little bit more sealant to a larger tyre, so you might want to add another sort of 10 or 20 grams to that for extra sealant. But as a proportion of the weight of me and my bike, it's about 0.3% of that total weight. The testing consisted of 3 parts. There was timed downhill runs on 3 different downhill tracks, roll down tests, which test for rolling resistance on a smooth fire road and a rough fire road, and there were climbing tests, again on a smooth fire road and a steeper rough fire road. When testing on the technical terrain, I used 3 tracks which I knew really well, and I made sure I did 2 scoping runs before I got the timer out so that I was up to speed and familiar with the track. Then I tested at least 2 times on each tyre, up to 4 times on each tyre, so up to 12 runs in total. Crucially, I changed tyres between each run, and after I had done 1 run on each tyre, I reversed the order for the second run, and so on. All this was to minimize the effects of becoming more familiar with the terrain or possibly fatigue, basically the order in which the tyres were tested. I chose to test on 3 different tracks with quite different terrain. The first was very greasy and slippery on the day that I tested, with lots of off-camber routes and some rutty, tight turns towards the bottom. The second track was much longer, more of a UK-style downhill track, with flat turns at the top, some jumps and matted routes in the middle, and some bike parky style berms and jumps towards the bottom. The third track was much steeper and more natural, with some loose rocks, a bit of mud, more routes, and some tight twisty corners. On the greasy, rooty track, the average time was 30.6 seconds on the 2.3-inch tyres. I went 1.3% faster on the 2.6s, with an average time of 30.2 seconds, and 3.3% faster than the 2.3s on the 2.8s, with a time of 29.6 seconds. On the downhill track, the average time was 1 minute 59.8 on the 2.3s. I went just 0.3% faster on the 2.6s, with a time of 1 minute 59.4. and 2.2% faster on the 2.8s, with a time of 1 minute 57.2. On the steep and natural track, my average time was 1 minute 41.4 on the 2.3s, and I was 1.5% quicker on the 2.6s, at 1 minute 39.9, and 2.6% faster on the 2.8s, with a time of 1 minute 38.8. So on all 3 tracks, the 2.6s were marginally faster than the 2.3s, and the 2.8s were faster again. If we look at all 24 timed runs from all 3 tracks together, we find that the 2.6 tyres were on average 0.9% faster than the 2.3s, and the 2.8 tyres were on average 2.5% faster than the 2.3s. But just looking at the average doesn't tell the whole story. To find out if these results mean anything, we have to look at something called the statistical significance of the results. Basically, this tells you the probability that you could get those differences just by chance, just through random variation. So what we have to do is use something called a student's t-test, which tells you the probability that you could get these differences in the times through just random variation, as opposed to a significant systematic difference between the times with one tyre size to the next tyre size. In this case, we found that the difference between the 2.3 and the 2.6 is not statistically significant. The general standard in science is that if there's more than a 5% chance of the results being due to random variation, then that doesn't count as statistically significant. Now in this case, I found that the difference between the 2.3-inch and the 2.6-inch tyres had a 7% chance of being due to random variation, so that's not statistically significant. However, the difference between the 2.3 and the 2.8 was statistically significant, just a 1% chance of being due to random variation, and the difference between the 2.6 and the 2.8 was significant as well. In other words, we can't say from these results that the 2.6 is necessarily faster than the 2.3, even though it was faster on average on all 3 tracks. But we can say that the 2.8 is significantly faster than the 2.6 and the 2.3 in this test. Now there are some caveats to that, of course. These times pertain only to the 3 tracks that I tested on, and it's been unusually dry here, so I didn't get to do much testing in muddy conditions. Not only that, they pertain only to these tyres, only to me as well, and crucially, this is not a blind test. I was aware of what tyres I was running each time, and I may have come into this test with certain expectations of how each tyre was going to perform. But quite apart from how fast I was going and what the numbers tell us, it's worth talking about how the tyres felt to ride. The first thing to say is that at these pressures, and I'm aware that I was running the 2.8-inch tyres a bit harder than what some people would ride a plus tyre at, I didn't notice any more tyre squirm on those bigger tyres. They didn't feel any more vague in the corners. However, I did notice that they felt a bit more bouncy, particularly when I was braking hard and the rear wheel became unweighted. It would start to become a little bit more unsettled and gave a sort of bouncy sensation to the bike as you rode it. To some extent, this could be calmed down by slowing down the rebound, but I chose to keep my suspension settings identical for this test. I can't say I found this particularly distracting though, even when taking off and landing from pretty large jumps, but that may be down to the bike I was riding. Because the Specialized Enduro has 170mm of travel, it's quite a linear suspension as well. I think that a lot of the bump energy is absorbed by the suspension and dissipated in the dampers. Whereas if you have a softer tyre and a firmer suspension, then more of the energy will be absorbed by the tyre, which is essentially undamped, and so more of that energy will be returned to you and give you that bouncy sensation. So my bike setup and tyre setup is probably quite well suited to minimizing that bouncy effect, which is probably why it didn't really bother me too much. But despite running the 2.8-inch tyres perhaps harder than most people would, I still found that the ride was smoother, particularly over high-frequency bumps, and that I had more grip. There were certain corners I rode multiple times on each tyre, and I found with the 2.3-inch tyres in particular, the front wheel was starting to wash and run wide, whereas the 2.8s were gripping really nicely. And that may be influenced by psychological bias, as we touched on earlier, but I consistently found I could corner harder on the bigger tyres, despite going on average faster on every track. So it's all very well that the bigger tyres were better for descending, but does that come at cost in terms of rolling resistance or climbing speed? Usually with tyres, more grip comes at a cost in terms of rolling speed. So I did some roll down tests to gauge the rolling resistance of the tyres.
A roll down test consists of riding downhill on a slight gradient without pedaling or braking and timing how long it takes to roll between 2 marker points. I set off just above the first marker at exactly the same point every run and adopted the same position too, seated with straight arms. I did 6 timed runs for each tyre size, so 18 in total. I did this on 2 surfaces, a smooth fire road and a rough track. On the rougher track, the 2.3 and 2.6-inch tyres took the same time to complete the course to the nearest tenth of a second. In both cases, the average time over all 6 runs was 52.5 seconds. However, the 2.8-inch tyres went 4.2% faster on average, with a time of 50.3 seconds. On the smooth fire road, the 2.3-inch tyres averaged 1 minute and 4 seconds dead. The 2.6-inch tyres were 2.3% faster, taking 1 minute and 2.5 seconds, and the 2.8s were 2.1% faster than the 2.3s, with an average time of 1 minute and 2.6 seconds.
So on the rougher surface, I found absolutely no difference between the 2.3-inch and the 2.6-inch tyres, which is probably because the actual depth of the tyre, so the vertical distance between the outer tread and the rim, is only about 1 millimeter difference between the 2.3 and the 2.6. Most of the difference in those tyres is the width, not the height. And so there isn't actually that much extra depth with which the tyres can absorb bumps. However, with the 2.8-inch tyres, they're considerably deeper. They seem to offer a smoother ride over the rough terrain and carried more speed. And they did so with a statistically significant difference, and they were on average about 4% faster. I think this is because the 2.8-inch tyres absorb more of the bump energy, and because there's very little damping in a tyre, they can return some of that energy into forward motion after you pass over the bump. Whereas with a narrower tyre, the tyre absorbs less of the bump, and so more of the bump goes into the suspension and into the rider, which is much more damped and so returns much less of that energy into forward motion as you pass over the bump. So this is why bigger tyres tend to perform better in terms of rolling resistance over rough terrain, and this is something that road bikers and gravel riders are starting to find, that the rougher the terrain, the bigger the tyre you want to offer the minimum rolling resistance. But on the smoother fire roads, which wasn't completely smooth, the 2.8 inch tyres were still faster than the 2.3 inch tyres, though not on average as fast as the 2.6. Now the difference between the 2.6 and the 2.8 is not statistically significant, so we can't really say that the 2.6 is faster than the 2.8, they were about the same, but both are faster than the 2.3 by a statistically significant amount on this surface. So even though this fire road is relatively smooth, it's still rough enough that the bigger tyres, the bigger 2 tyres, are faster than the 2.3 on this surface. I did a quick test on tarmac as well, and the 2.8 inch were considerably slower than the 2.3, as you might expect. But what's surprising is that you don't need a particularly rough surface before the bigger tyres start to become faster than the 2.3 inch tyres. The final thing to test was climbing speed. So I chose 2 climbs, the same smooth fire road that I tested for the roll down tests, and a steeper, rougher climb. I used an SRM power meter so that I could constantly monitor my power and keep the power the same. On the smoother, flatter climb, I aimed to average 250 watts, and on the steeper climb, I aimed to average 300 watts.
At an average power of 304 watts, the 2.3 inch tyres were the fastest up the steep climb, with an average time of 5 minutes 43.7 seconds. The 2.6 tyres were 0.07% slower at 5 minutes 44 dead, and the 2.8s were 0.14% slower with an average time of 5 minutes 44.2 seconds. On the smooth fire road, with an average power of 253 watts, the 2.3 inch tyres took 1 minute and 4.9 seconds to complete the course. The 2.6s were 1.5% faster here, with an average time of 1 minute and 3.3 seconds. And the 2.8s were 1.2% faster than the 2.3s, with an average time of 1 minute and 3.6.
Now, because I was able to constantly monitor my power output, but also my average power output throughout the run, I was able to get the average power to within a few watts every time. I also did some runs at a much higher power output, in which I found that the increase in power was proportional almost exactly to the increase in speed. And then I used that information to calibrate the other times to a consistent power so that they could be compared like for like. On the rougher and steeper climb, I found no significant difference between all of the tyres. On average, there was a 0.14% difference between the smallest and biggest tyres, which is considerably less than the 0.35% difference in weight between the whole system, the bike and the rider, with the 2.3s relative to the 2.8s. So despite that difference in weight, we see much less of a difference in the time taken to do this climb. Perhaps because the 2.8s are offering less rolling resistance on this quite bumpy surface. There was much more of a difference on the smoother track. Just like with the roll down tests, I found that the 2.3 inch tyres were the slowest, and the 2.6 and the 2.8s were significantly faster, but there was no statistically significant difference between the 2.6 and the 2.8, even though the 2.6 was once again the fastest tyre on this surface. So to sum up, when it comes to technical descents, the biggest tyres were the fastest in this test and the smallest tyres were the slowest. When it comes to rolling resistance on bumpy terrain, we once again found the biggest tyres were the fastest. But on the smoother fire roads, it was hard to say whether the 2.6 or the 2.8 were the fastest, but the 2.3s were definitely the slowest there. Even when it came to climbing very steep gradients, there were only small differences in the times despite the increase in weight of the bigger tyres. All this makes quite a strong case for the bigger tyres, which may not be surprising for those of you who have watched my previous video comparing plus tyres with skinnier tyres, or Joe's video comparing 2.0 to 2.2 inch tyres for cross country. Once again, we found that the bigger tyres offer more traction and less rolling resistance in bumpy terrain. What I haven't found is any evidence that 2.6 is some kind of best of both worlds. I think it's a compromise. It's not as comfortable or as grippy or as fast over technical terrain as 2.8, but it is a bit better in those regards than 2.3. I think it's much like how 650B wheels were sold as a compromise between 29 and 26. They offer some of the advantages of 29, but not all of them. And we're seeing nowadays more and more people going all the way to 29, even in World Cup downhill racing. I'm not sure if we'll ever see that in tyre size. I don't know if there'll ever be a big market for 2.8-inch tyres, but 2.6 certainly only offers some of the advantages of a plus tyre. The issue of puncture resistance remains unanswered. We didn't get any punctures in this test, but in order to make a 2.8-inch tyre that's not only light enough, but also supple enough to gain that advantage in terms of rolling resistance over bumps, there is often a compromise in terms of puncture resistance. But I think the main takeaway from this is that I would fit the biggest tyre that I could fit into my frame, which still offers me enough puncture resistance and has the tread pattern and compound that I want. So the right size of tyre for you may depend on how much you're willing to risk puncturing. But based on this testing, I can say that the bigger tyre is probably going to be faster.